One of the things that may not be entirely obvious to people who watch my channel is that while I have a great passion for medieval history and history in general and weapons and martial arts, I actually have a very strong interest in a completely separate field, and that is film and filmmaking. I'm a huge film history buff, history part being somewhat obvious, but I'm also really interested in the technical details, and I really enjoy the medium. I enjoy watching movies, watching films, and just enjoying that art and that culture for what it is. And I haven't really ever done anything that's kind of a true, just general movie review on my channel. I've done a few in the past that were kind of mediocre. And I've been wanting to do that as just kind of an effort to begin diversifying some of the content on my channel. It's a thing I think is actually becoming more and more necessary in the way YouTube operates these days. And because it's a real passion of mine, pretty much is equal to, if not almost more so than my passion for history and swords and all that, I wanted to actually start doing movie reviews. And so we're going to kick this off. I thought I was going to actually kick it off with the Avengers Infinity Wars movie, because I've been really looking forward to that one. I figured it'd be a good place to start, kind of as that franchise reaches its peak. But honestly, there's a film that's come along that I want to speak to so much more that I'm going to go ahead and do it now. I want to just go ahead and note that my reviews in general will start off being non-spoiler, and then we'll go into spoilers. I will always call that out in time codes where you can skip to in the video, to ensure that if you want to see the review spoiler-free, you can do so. And it will be very necessary for this review because I want to talk about a movie that, quite honestly, is probably one of the best I've seen in, I would at least say, the past 5 years, if not one of the best I've seen in the past decade, in my opinion. And I really enjoyed it, so I want to make sure everyone has a chance to go see it. And that film is A Quiet Place. Certainly one of the most surprising elements of A Quiet Place, which has been marketed as a horror thriller, is the director, John Krasinski. And that's because he is so famously associated with more lighthearted fare, at kind of worst case scenario drama, and best case is usually comedy. He's best known for his lead role, or one of his lead roles, in The Office, The American Office, which ran for 9 seasons. He's almost so well established that character, it's very hard to divorce him as an actor from that character. And yet he does a very good job both in the directing role and the acting role in this film. His understanding of the film medium, while he may not have as strong an understanding of the horror film medium, he understands film and filmmaking, and he knows how to break the rules in ways that are extremely effective. This movie, as per its title and as per what you may have seen in trailers, uses the best use of silence that I've ever seen in a film. Ever since film came into a medium where it had sound and sound effects, it pretty much goes end to end. You never have a really silent period. The closest you ever come to that would be like a war film where an explosion goes off and you have the moment of deafening ringing that's happening in someone's ears. That's the closest you usually get in a film. Yet here you have entire stretches of the film that can run 10 to 20 minutes where everything is almost at a dead silence, and you really don't have really any sounds except for maybe the slight rustling of someone's clothes or the slight scuffling of feet on ground, and that's about it. And besides that, you only have the ambient noise. And it's amazing. It's the only time I've ever seen a movie in the theater as well where a rather packed audience comparatively was really quite quiet because they didn't have a choice. They couldn't talk. They couldn't even munch their popcorn very loudly because it was so quiet in that theater. And yet it worked so effectively for the film for its purposes. Now, this film was marketed, like I said, as a horror thriller, and I think that's kind of a gross miscategorization, at least as far as what we would typically think of as horror or thriller. Usually with the concept of a thriller, it's really a mind-bending concept. You don't really know what's going to happen next. You can't quite predict what's going to happen. And it's not out of the sense of drama, but it's out of a sense of enforced confusion. So I think of something like even Ocean's 11, which is kind of a heist movie that has that thriller element. And you really don't know until it happens exactly what's happening or how it's going to happen. And likewise with horror film, you tend to think of overwhelming dread, and you tend to think of really honestly overwhelming gore and violence and death. and that tends to be the cloud that sits over the concept of a horror thriller. And yet I would say that it really doesn't quite meet the thriller and only barely meets the horror. And yet this film operates so much better as just a drama. Ultimately, it is a film that really operates best when you consider it to just be about the characters and the relationships to each other. All of the set piece of this post-apocalyptic world where there are these kind of unknown creatures that are hunting people based on the sounds they make, that's just a set piece to help further the story of this family that's in somewhat of a distress and their interactions with each other, and based on the history of what they've gone through, how they've coped. You could easily set this in a war era, war-torn country and have many of the same elements. But where this really gets effectively used is really between some of the three primary characters of the film, which is John Krasinski in the role as the father, and his relationship to his daughter and to his wife, and Emily Blunt, who is John Krasinski's real life wife, is also playing his wife in this film. And they cast a fantastic actress whose name I forget right now. She's very new to it, but they cast an actress who is actually deaf, and it lends this element of realism and true to life aspect of what her life would be like in this universe, and it all blends so perfectly. Now, the filmmaking itself is incredibly well done. There has been a lot of push to speak to the fact that this was shot on actual film, which means that the colors and the way that the interactions with the contrast and all work, it's beautiful. Cinematography is beautiful, and it works very well as kind of a lower end, lower budget film, and yet you never really feel at any point, even with the special effects, that this is in any way a low-budget film. It is done masterfully, and everyone who's involved in that film did an obvious good job because it looks so amazing and it feels so amazing. You get engrossed basically immediately, and even though it's a relatively short film, I mean, it's still an hour and a half, and it's surprising that is a short film these days, but it sucks you in, and it doesn't really let go of you for the entirety of the time. Now, there are a few elements that I feel aren't perfect. There are a few times that they basically, in my opinion, actually kind of look down upon the audience, and they kind of make things a little bit too apparent. I'm sure it would be great for movie-going audiences that aren't maybe as spot on or as intelligent or aren't able to make some connection points quickly. But I do think that detracts from the film, and I don't want to say too much more about that because that could get into spoiler territory. But I feel like the acting was fantastic, the direction was fantastic, even the rare times that there was any type of musical score, that was spot on. It was doing exactly what it needed to do. And this film just felt right. And the message that this film actually gives at the end of it, like how you feel at the end of it, is all correct. And it's one of the first times I honestly can't even remember how long, that a horror film actually ended so well and so perfectly, that I left satisfied and excited with how it ended, and yet still not completely resolved, which is a fantastic feat of filmmaking, in my opinion. It's obviously fantastic writing. John Krasinski, in many different interviews, talked about how he had no interest in doing a horror film, and yet because of how this was written and what the plot was and what the actual heart of the story was, he felt like it was something that he could have all the passion in the world for. And I can completely understand why that would be, because again, you can pull out all the horror elements and you're right there with these characters and their drama and their lives, regardless of what happens in the set piece. And it's such a wonderful story just in and of itself that, again, I think it's almost mislabeled as being horror, because that gets it categorized with really just trashy films that don't really have much purpose and don't connect you to the characters. Now, going into spoilers, I will say that this is just an incredibly fine job at creating creatures that are believable within the world. And while some of the rules don't necessarily always apply equally, and there are certainly some plot holes that kind of come up with the ideas of how these creatures hear you and the environment around it, you can easily dismiss that for the plot. When you go into it, the trailers actually surprisingly gave away less than you'd really think. And you really start off this film in something of a gut punch, really. And I would liken it to, in some ways, the kid-friendly film Up, where the first 10 minutes are very nearly devastating. I mean, there's such a crushing introduction to an hour and a half long children's film. And this one has very much the same thing, because you have this family of a father and a mother and their three children, one who is just kind of a toddler age, a little bit older than toddler, and that little child dies at the hands of one of these monstrous creatures. And that sets the tone for what's to come. And really, a lot of the drama isn't even that, because it's really the result of that. So there's kind of two plots that happen simultaneously, and they really drive at, primarily the drama is between the character that Emily Blunt plays, which is the mother who is having to give birth, and the process of giving birth, which is painful, and you have to make noise about, and giving birth to a baby that's going to also make noise, and the preparation and the trying to prevent bad things from happening in that process is kind of one plot thread. And then you have a plot thread between the father and his deaf daughter, and basically the daughter actually was the person who kind of was at fault for the death of their other child. And there's this belief in her mind that she is guilty of this, and that her father hates her and resents her. And yet that's not true, but the father has a hard time showing it. And through his efforts throughout the entire film to keep his children and his wife safe at all costs, up to and including his life, is just this incredible struggle that, again, you could put this in a war-torn country and have kind of the same thing. The use of sign language is incredibly impactful, actually, in this case, especially right near the end of John Krasinski's character, where he is looking to communicate to his daughter, who's far away from him, that he loves her, right before he's going to die. He's going to sacrifice his life for the sake of his children. And it's this really, really touching moment in the way it's shot, in the way it's framed, and the fact that it's not done by voice, but it's done in action, which is something that's very rare. The elements of the deaf daughter, and that the way the film actually pulls into near complete silence whenever it's in her perspective, which they do periodically to great effect for different reasons. When they pull out all the sound, it puts you so much more on edge, even the times that you really probably don't need to be on edge. And being on edge is kind of how you operate in this film. It keeps you on the edge of your seat pretty much the entire time. And surprisingly, in an hour and a half long horror film, they really only use about 3 jump scares. And I would say one of those only really counts as a proper jump scare. The other ones are just proper scares. They aren't false flags for some terrible thing happening. But it's all used really effectively to show just how unprepared someone is in this environment where you can't make a noise, when you can't even tell what noises you're making, and you're kind of just generally unable to cope within this world, and yet you have to. And the dynamics of the family are beautifully done. It's completely believable. Part of that might be real-life chemistry between actual husband and wife, but I feel like the chemistry even between them and their children, or their children in the film, are really incredible and really believable, and really, honestly, again, for a horror film, quite beautiful. It's amazing to see a movie with such heart that is a horror film. Now, there are a few major plot holes. People have, I'm sure, brought this up in other reviews, that there's a little bit of inconsistency with what the creatures can hear. There's sometimes noises are made and the creatures don't hear it, but there's quieter noises that they do hear. There's elements to how the creatures die, which is basically matching a certain frequency that aren't entirely clear what the rules of that are. It's not really they die, they're weak to that. And a lot of this stuff is actually displayed in the background on this big whiteboard, which I think is probably unnecessary, and really, honestly, could have been described in other ways. Really, because this whiteboard sat in the background of many shots of this family's house, it would have been better almost to put that in someone else's house for them to come across in the act of scavenging or something like that, so they come across it and have some understanding. It would be only slightly there, just enough to inform the audience, and they move on. But the fact that it was always in the background was honestly a little bit distracting, and I felt was a little bit too heavy-handed in just trying to inform the audience, and it was completely unnecessary because really, honestly, the things you don't know were fine. What they never explained wasn't really necessary to be explained. All those details, all those kind of plot holes are things that don't matter for the heart of the story, which again are just the relationships between the members of this family. There's a film that's actually really, really similar to this in terms of having a really solid heart to the story that I think I'll actually do a review of, even though it's not a film that's actually in the theaters, has been probably never in the theaters, but it's a film called The Hollow, which is the story of a husband and their wife, and they're moving to Ireland, and the stories of the fairy people, and they're trying to steal away their baby, and through what happens in that, there's a lot of self-sacrifice for their children. And again, it's a beautiful story that actually works really well. But similar to A Quiet Place, again, you just have this heart to it that I think is really quite amazing. And I wanted to see it based on the trailers alone. I thought it was a really clever concept, but I didn't know how they're really going to do it in film. And they just nailed it, right? It was so perfectly executed in the ways that it needed to be perfectly executed. In the ways that it didn't matter, they didn't worry about it. They worried more about what was really necessary for the film. So overall, I cannot give this film higher praise. I think John Krasinski as a director, no matter what he directs from here on out, is going to be someone to watch. You're going to want to watch his films. He's going to be a good, notable future director. And I hope that he never goes big budget, because it shows that he has the skill to do the lower budget films. And it really speaks volumes that this film is actually doing so well in theaters right now. I mean, they're making so much money off of this movie, and I think word of mouth is really getting around that this is actually such a good movie, and you walk away with it so fulfilled and so kind of energized for what happens in the story that was told, that you don't ever feel like you walked away and you just had spectacle and you kind of forget it the next day, which is honestly what a lot of films these days do. They're all spectacle, they're all big explosions or big superhero films, which are fun, but they don't have as much heart to them as they could. And this, I feel like, is a really good starting off point for kind of a rebirth of cinema being something more, but still being accessible to audiences and not being very artsy films that are just seeking after an Oscar nomination, but instead one that can be both incredibly impactful and tell a great story and have great drama, but also be great for general audiences to just enjoy and be different enough, and not just a strict historical drama or period piece or trying to make some sort of political statement like a lot of films do these days. So highly recommend it. It is a fantastic film. Go watch it in theaters if you still can, because it's still doing well, so it'll be there. But, there's a lot of films coming up that are going to start knocking out some of these older films from theaters. If you don't get it there, or if you have a really bad movie-going audience that are making a lot of noise, which I'd be very surprised because it's hard to do, then when it comes out on DVD or Blu-ray, go get it, turn off all your lights, put away your phone, get yourself where there is no other noise or sound, and just get yourself absorbed into this film for the hour-and-a-half ride. It is just absolutely fantastic. I'm ecstatic for this movie, and I'm telling everyone I know to go see it. So guys, go see it before it's gone. Wonderful movie, and I think you'll enjoy it greatly.